Welcome to the MAM Journals. I first saw this bike actually in the Birmingham show in November last year, and I've been looking forward to riding it ever since. I'm actually a big fan of the Royal Enfield brand. I've enjoyed their progressive approach and the innovation they're now bringing to the market. I've actually got for those of you who don't know, I've got an Enfield Interceptor which started life as a 650 but has now sort of morphed into an 865, which has been great fun. This, of course, is not the first Super Meteor that Royal Enfield had made. They opened the batting in the 50s with the Meteor. The Super Meteor came along in, I think, 1955, 56. It was, I'm going from memory here, 692, 93cc twin, produced 40 brake horsepower, weighed 184 kilos. Interesting when you compare it to the weight of this. The bike was pretty mundane. It would do 100 miles an hour, but it was sold as a bike that could either be used for a sidecar or indeed as a solo. And the bike that was in America, the Trailblazer, sold under the Indian brand and under license, was actually positioned as a solo. But it was one of the bikes that contributed to the bike's nickname at the time, or the brand's nickname at the time, the Royal Enfield. They did take a little bit of engineering to do. The bike lasted, I think, until 1963 in production, and then they went to the Constellations and the Interceptors. So this is the revival of the Super Meteor, and it's great to see it. I do love the way they keep tying the heritage back in as they advance the brand. I'm not a usual rider of cruising bikes. In fairness, a story against myself. I think the only time I've ever really ridden a cruiser in anger, I once, many years ago, took a Harley Davidson out as one of the guys in the dealership threw me the keys and said, well, just try one, see what you think. I got to the first roundabout, and about, I would say, maybe 20% of the way around the roundabout, everything was on the deck, and I lifted the rear wheel from the floor. So I managed to save it, pull it back upright, pottered back to the dealership, said, I don't think I'm quite ready for a cruiser. But that was more my failing than anything to do with the bike. You have to ride them in a different way. And I was looking forward to riding this because it's not what my experience normally is. I ride either sports bikes or more upright retros. But I can see myself gradually evolving to something with a foot forward position. People were constantly asking me, immediately I was riding it via social media, and think, well, what do you think? What do you think? What's your first impressions? And to be honest, it was very difficult for me to answer that because I've got no base point. You know, if I ride a sports bike, I can compare it to a 1000 RR and say, well, it's faster than that or slower than that, or a GSX R750 or one of my other sports bikes. I have benchmarks. With this, I've got no benchmark. So I had to ride it in a more objective way and just quietly analysing what it was doing on the road and what it was like to ride. To help you through this review, I'm going to go through the specifications of the bikes, what it's fitted with, and a few comments and observations. We're then going to use some GoPro to illustrate what it was like to ride, and then we'll be coming back and I'll be making some concluding comments and remarks. As always, I hope that you enjoy the video. Okay, so let's have a look around the bike and I'll go through the specifications. I'll make some comparisons, obviously, to the other models that are fitted with the same engine and make some observations about the quality of the finish and equipment levels. So if we think of the 650s as being the GT, the Interceptor and the Super Meteor, they're all fitted with this same 648cc air and oil-cooled twin. It's fuel injected. It produces 46.8 brake horsepower at 7250. The Super Meteor produces slightly less. I guess there'll be some anomalies in what they've done with the fueling and how it rides, which I'll discuss later. But the Newton meters at 52.3 is identical to the Interceptor, although it produces it at 5,650 revs rather than the 5150 produced on the Interceptor. It's a 6-speed bike, obviously with this foot forward position. And again, I'll give you feedback when we ride it. It's fitted, in terms of wheels, it's fitted with 19-inch front and a 16-inch rear. Nice to see that they've gone to these alloys with tubeless, and I consider that a step forward. The brakes on the bike are different to the Interceptor and the GT, in so much as it's got a 300mm rear disc, and again I'll give you feedback when I'm about riding it. Suspension has now been upgraded with this Showa front forks, which are 43mm as opposed to 41 fitted to the Interceptor. The rear has had obviously different shock absorbers to reflect the different geometry of the bike, because it's quite a bit different in terms of its layout, and that comes across in its dimensions. The engine is actually what's called a stressed member, i.e. where it's joining in, it's doing part of the frame's job, as opposed to just a conventional cradle where the engine sits within it. Now, the geometry of this bike is significantly different, and the best way to sort of instantly get a grasp of that is both obviously visually looking at it, but the measurement of the wheelbase tells you that the standard Interceptor is 1398mm, whilst this bike is 1500mm, so quite a big difference in the wheelbase. And indeed the rake at the front there, it's now 27.6 against a much sharper rake on the Interceptor of 24 degrees. Those dimensions would really indicate to you that the bike is going to be more stable at speed but less agile and quick to turn. But again, I'll make comments on that during the riding section. The bike has put on quite a bit of weight. The original Interceptor was 213 kilograms, whilst this is 241 kilograms. So 28 bags of sugar more. But in fairness, it doesn't necessarily feel like that when you're riding it. But I know that will be something that some riders who bought the original 350 metre will be wary of, making sure that it's not got to the weight where it's too heavy for them to handle comfortably. Try the bike. I didn't feel it was excessive. In terms of pricing and sort of modelling, they're gradually creeping up, but my Interceptor was, I think I bought it in 2019, I think it was £5,700. So these are 20% higher, but I still think they're very good value, and they are progressing. As I say, they've got the tubeless alloys, they've now got an LED front and rear, they've got the upgraded suspension. The general finishes continue to improve. I particularly like the welding and this finishing on it. Ron Dennis was once asked, was he basing his new McLaren, his first road car, on the Ferrari F40? And he paused for a moment and said, "No, I don't think I've got anybody who can weld that badly." Now, the point that I'm making is the F40 was a fine car, and the welds were very safe and very structural, which is the first thing you've got to look on a weld. Aesthetics comes later, but you don't need to be beautiful in order to be effective. But I think they've gone to extra lengths on this, and I like the way it's very tidy. And if you just look at, you can compare some of these welds with the welds on a much more expensive Ducati from a few years ago, you can see what I mean. I like this graphite finish on the cases and the sort of fleck in it. I think it's both attractive, and I think it'd be easier to live with than my polished finishes on my Interceptor, which I find very attractive, but it's certainly a career keeping it in that sort of condition. This is a bike that you probably want to do some more miles on. I've got no connections with Royal Enfield, and I'm certainly not sponsored in any shape or form, but I have enjoyed watching the sort of company coming of age, and I'm interested to see where Aisha take this business. They've certainly done a lot since they acquired it in '94, and indeed the son took over. He's obviously a keen motorcyclist and saw that there was a business lurking in there just trying to escape. He's done well with it. This particular bike, I say this new Meteor, is available in 3 formats, because I don't normally bother with telling you through the specs, but I think as it's such a new bike, it'd probably be helpful. They do a base bike which is called the Astral. That's flat paint and it's available in black, blue or green, and that's at 6,799. They do this one, which is the middle of the range, an Interstellar. That's metallic paint and it's available in green and grey, and that's 6,999 plus on the road packaging. And then they do what's called a Celestial, which is like the touring version. I think it's got a one-piece, I've not seen one in the metal, a one-piece seat on it. It's got that rear seat guard support on the back. It's got a screen, and that's available in blue or red. And that's the top of the range, 7,299. Although a pretty traditional looking bike, there are some nice little nods to modern technology, and you've obviously got a contact point in there. Interestingly, this is metal, and indeed so is the one on the other side, which I can't remember the last time I saw a metal side cover. Maybe contributing towards the weight, but certainly nicely done and gives a nice finish. This is a new bike, and I was running it in, avoiding both full throttle and labouring the engine in high gear with low revs. My thanks, as always, to King's Two Wheel Centre for their generous loan of the bike. The 6-speed gearbox was smooth, easy and precise. I didn't actually miss a gear in 300 miles of riding. I did have an occasional game of let's find neutral, but it was certainly not prolonged, and I suspect it will improve with a few more miles on the gearbox. The engine felt willing, pulling well from low revs, enabling comfortable initial acceleration. I actually deliberately don't read any road tests on a bike that I know I am likely to test until I've finished riding it. I felt that the bike had much more initial torque than the standard Interceptor, which of course I had and then converted, and was relieved to read that this is exactly what the different air filter, exhaust and ECU map are designed to deliver. No more powerful than the GT or the Interceptor, it makes good progress in the early stages and low revs. A friend briefly rode Pillion and commented that it appeared to go well, and that was without any excessive throttle requests. The suspension and handling was good, but not perfect. Personally, I found the rear shock a little harsh, for that read firm, but I am a great believer that suspension settling down is actually part of the running in of a bike. It may well soften with a few more 100 miles on it. I did like the front forks, and I thought they were a really big step forward to those fitted on my Interceptor initially. It is quite a heavy bike, and I thought it might bottom out under firm braking. It didn't. The bike coped well with what in Oxfordshire we loosely call roads. Secure across the numerous raked and damaged surfaces, although not particularly keen on potholes. Not many bikes are, in fairness, but the weight and geometry probably highlighted this characteristic further. On smoother, more sensibly maintained roads, the bike handled predictably and securely. I liked it. The bike rides well at slower speeds, although I'm not quite sure how the current fashion of 20 miles per hour in some Oxfordshire towns actually help. Not wanting to labour the bike in third and a little too much for second to be quite right, I will take some convincing that this 33% reduction in speed actually equates to a 33% reduction of emissions, although I did see less bodies lying in the road from all those 30 mile per hour accidents that we so desperately need to stop. This is Witney, an historic market town, probably most famous for its blankets, and not best pleased with the arrival of the duvet. Now it's more of a dormitory town for Oxford, where it is used to support its car manufacturing, the universities and professional services. Mentioning the word car in Oxford is now, of course, a lynching offence. Meanwhile, back in the real world, The bike is very comfortable, and I know that the leg forward riding position is strongly favoured by some who find tucking themselves into sports bikes more painful than fun. There is certainly plenty of room. Indeed, the bars are for me slightly too far away, and I ride with slightly straighter arms than I would normally choose. I'm 5'8". With the low seat height, it is easy to transition from legs forward to legs down as required. Although I did 300 miles, I didn't actually have the time nor the opportunity to try a long run, which would be the logical way to test its long ride comfort. The brakes were good, if not exceptional, and the rear in particular was significantly better than certainly the GT and the Interceptor, based on the same engine, and indeed many other bikes I've ridden. I'm not an experienced cruiser bike rider, but understand that this characteristic is often built into the bike, and I can see why. I certainly found myself using the rear brake significantly more than I would on other bikes. So, having done 300 miles, what are my initial conclusions and thoughts? So, how did I get on? Well, although I said at the beginning this is not the usual style of bike and type of bike that I ride, I have enjoyed it. It's been fun. The bike goes quite well, and that's not damned by praise. I just think my expectations of some bikes, I do expect sporty performance from a sports tourer, but a cruiser is slightly different. I think once run in, this bike will cruise comfortably all day at 80 mile an hour where it's appropriate, and its early stage acceleration is certainly perfectly acceptable. Some bikes that I ride, I've done 200, maybe 300 miles, and I feel like I've explored all that I want to on the bike. I'll be honest, this one, I didn't feel I get there. I'd actually really welcome doing a longer term test on a bike like this, possibly the Celeste, the touring version, and actually going away and seeing what it would be like on a longer tour for a few days with a bit of luggage. Because I think that's where the bike might really come into its own, although it's perfectly adequate having a fun day out for a 70-80 miles ride out to see your friends. I continue to be impressed by the continuous improvement that Royal Enfield put into the brand, and for me that's one of the fascinating aspects of this story, how they're really upgrading their manufacturing capability and some of the design features. Who will buy the bike? Well, when I look at the marketing from Royal Enfield, it has what I can best describe as photographs of hipsters, whatever they are, on the bikes. But every time I go to a cafe car park and Royal Enfield owners take their helmets off, I'll be honest, they look a bit like me. But I think it's a good bike with a well-proven engine, and it will sell well. The best way, of course, to establish whether you like a bike or not is to go to the dealer and have a go. See if you like it. I was impressed. I'm impressed by the increasing quality, I'm impressed by the ride, and I'm impressed by the value. I do hope that you found this video helpful and interesting. Hopefully, if you did, you might be kind enough to press like or even consider subscribing to the channel if you've not already done so. But as always, regardless of whether you do any of that, ride safe and stay well.